once you get on them, just open them up.
Yeah, Roger.
Light them all up.
002 traffic, 260s.
Come on, fire.
Yeah, Roger.
Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
This was the slaughter known as the First World War. 16 millions died and 21 million were wounded. At the height of the carnage, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, had a private chat with the editor of The Guardian, C.P. Scott. If people really knew the truth, said the Prime Minister, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't know and can't know. The British public were desperate for real news. More than half the nation flocked to see an official propaganda film, The Battle of the Somme. Cameras were so unusual that young troops would shout, "Hello, Mum," as they marched to the front, and they were heard crying for their mothers as they died on the battlefield. This was almost never reported. These days, we have 24-hour news. The sound bites never stop, and the wars never stop. Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine. This film is about the war you don't see. Drawing on my own experience as a war correspondent, it will look mainly at television, concentrating on the most popular channels in America and Britain. The film will ask, what is the role of the media in rapacious wars like Iraq and Afghanistan? Why do many journalists beat the drums of war, regardless of the lies of governments? And how are the crimes of war reported and justified when they're our crimes? A pioneer of modern propaganda was this man, Edward Bernays. Bernays invented the term public relations. He wrote, "The intelligent manipulation of the masses is an invisible government which is the true ruling power in our country." He was part of a secretive group called the U.S. Committee on Public Information, set up in 1917 to persuade reluctant Americans to join the war in Europe.
Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann go to Woodrow Wilson and say, look, man, if you're going to enter into this war, we are going to need to sell this war to the American people. And so Wilson institutes and creates the first modern propaganda machinery. It was actually quite brilliant in its conceptualization, so that the best way to persuade people is to grab them by their emotions, by their unconscious and instinctual urges. Let's not bother with pumping out facts. Let's scare the hell out of people. A picture of the Statue of Liberty in tatters, crumbled into the New York harbor with German planes flying around it. A picture of the world being gobbled up by the bloody hands of a gorilla wearing a German helmet. So, you know, it's not about facts anymore. The facts don't matter.
For Edward Bernays, public relations was like a war on people, on bending their will. He persuaded women to smoke at a time when smoking in public was not considered ladylike. He convinced a group of debutantes to parade along Fifth Avenue, holding up Lucky Strike cigarettes as symbols of women's liberation. To his delight, the press called these torches of freedom.
What he was interested in doing was creating an association between a product, in this case cigarettes, and the desire for women's liberation. It worked in the sense that it got lots of news coverage. It worked in the sense that women started smoking publicly, and in fact, smoking became a symbol of the new woman, of the emancipated woman.
Love is like a cigarette. You know you held my heart aglow between your fingertips.
Iraq, March the 20th, 2003. The creation of illusions and the selling of war had come a long way since Edward Bernays. The selling of this invasion depended on the news media to promote a series of illusions, like the link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11.
The vision of the World War I poster of the Statue of Liberty in a shambles in New York Harbor is not that different from the image of the World Trade Center, a burning symbol that sort of entered into the stock footage of people's dreams. So immediately you have these associations between the image of the World Trade Center and Saddam Hussein and Iraq.
But Saddam Hussein had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with it, but that didn't matter. Because when you start using symbols that have been separated from their meaning and have sort of taken on a life of their own, the facts don't matter anymore.
This is the Pentagon, which spends almost $1 billion a year just on advertising, recruiting, propaganda, the selling of war.
There are Pentagon contracts with news organizations in terms of how to manipulate the news. There are Pentagon officials involved in press releases that go to the media in which intelligence is used to manipulate public opinion, which is a violation of the charter of any intelligence organization. Then you have retired generals who serve as press spokesmen for all the networks, and it's never revealed which military-industrial firms they work for.
Central to this is the co-opting and spinning of a media regarded as the freest in the world.
Showdown Iraq. If America goes to war, turn to MSNBC and the experts.
If we journalists, including myself, had right from the get-go, from the opening pop, had started asking the kind of tough, digging, aggressive questions we should have been asking, and doing our reporting, rather than just being kind of stenographers, go to a briefing, have an official say something, print it in the paper next day. If we had done our job, I do think a strong argument can be made that perhaps we would not have gone to war.
The attack on Iraq was sold by these two men. The blueprint for the invasion was this military doctrine called shock and awe, designed to paralyze the country and destroy food production, water supply, and other civilian infrastructure. The effect would be similar to the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. This was terrorizing people on a grand scale, and it would be covered up by deception in massive amounts. But this was not how it was reported at the time.
Scores of American reporters have now joined U.S. military units in Kuwait as part of the Pentagon's effort to make any war with Iraq what the Pentagon calls a media-friendly campaign.
A new word, embedding, entered media language in the planning for the invasion. Most of the reports that viewers saw came from within a system in which media organizations agreed to certain conditions laid down by the Ministry of Defense in London and the Pentagon in Washington.
At the time that our forces crossed into Iraq, we had some 700 reporters embedded throughout our military formations. Embedding was important for that conflict for a number of reasons. One being that we knew we were going up against an enemy that was somewhat masterful at misinformation, disinformation.
We have a number of correspondents in bed with our troops across the region.
And very deeply embedded in a personal way with the Marine that he's traveling with.
I love this expression for the Iraq War, the embedded journalists. Well, too many journalists have been in bed with the administration on a variety of issues. I would say 80 to 90% of what you read in a newspaper is officially inspired. If they're covering the intelligence community, for example, and they become critical of the CIA or a major intelligence organization, they're going to lose their sources. If they become critical of the Pentagon, it's going to be very difficult to get into the Pentagon to deal with official military sources. So I think journalists like to be part of the game, part of the inside crowd, and therefore the conventional wisdom is the best wisdom.
24-hour news in particular is a system that is the most easy to manipulate. 24-hour news is a giant echo chamber. So that's why, for example, Basra was reported as having fallen 17 times before it actually fell. And yet, within 24-hour news, when you're reporting it for the 7th time in that chain of 17 times when the city has fallen falsely, the fact that it's been wrong the previous 7 times just doesn't matter.
American armor is moving at will across whole swathes of Baghdad. This is
Raghi Omar reporting for the BBC from Baghdad. He describes the arrival of the Americans as a liberation.
People have come out welcoming them, holding up V signs. This is an image taking place across the whole of the Iraqi capital today.
But it was not happening across the rest of Iraq. This was another illusion. The toppling of a statue of Saddam Hussein was seized upon by the invading force as a target of opportunity. What was not news? Investigation describing how they exploited what they called a media circus. There are almost as many reporters as Iraqis, says the report. It was an American PSYOPs officer who ordered the statue brought down. The resulting TV pictures gave no sense of the bloody conquest of Iraq that was already well underway.
You know, I didn't really do my job properly. I think I'd hold my hand up and say that one didn't press the most uncomfortable buttons hard enough.
As you described the arrival of the Americans, you didn't tell us the story of how that whole statue was itself manipulated. Why not?
The entire live cameras of the world's press were on the balcony of the Palestine Hotel. And that was really the only events that they saw about Iraqis coming out. So it was a sort of made-for-TV moment. And the most telling moment in that whole day was when an American soldier climbed up a crane and put the American flag over the statue's face. Because in fact that was a true iconic moment of what had happened, that America had taken ownership of Iraq.
In Britain, Blair and Bush's invasion was applauded as a vindication of them and their strategy.
He said that they would be able to take Baghdad without a bloodbath and that in the end the Iraqis would be celebrating, and on both of those points he has been proved conclusively right, and it would be entirely ungracious, even for his critics, not to acknowledge that tonight he stands as a larger man and a stronger Prime Minister as a result.
It is absolutely, without a doubt, a vindication of the strategy.
It was a vindication for him. Those who said...
Should they, you know, use a Moab, the mother of all bombs, and a few daisy cutters, and, you know, let's not just stop at a couple of cruise missiles.
I've fallen almost in love with the F-18 Super Hornet because it's quite a versatile plane.
I got to tell you, my favorite aircraft, the A-10 Warthog. I love the Warthogs.
The war we don't see in Iraq is largely the massive toll on civilians in Iraq, where daily, even now, people are being killed and wounded because of this occupation.
Open the door!
Seeing what I see, contrasting that with what has been reported by most of the mainstream, it's like two completely different worlds.
In 2004, American Marines twice assaulted the city of Fallujah, the second time with British forces. A nightmare unfolded. The Americans made the city a free fire zone. The UN reported that 70% of the houses were destroyed and those standing were riddled with bullets. Thousands of civilians were killed. Little of this was shown on the majority TV networks in Britain and America. That the Americans met courageous resistance was not news at all. Viewers did not get a sense of the sheer scale of the suffering of ordinary people. This remarkable film from inside Fallujah was made by an American, Mark Manning, with Rana al-Ayyubi, an Iraqi. It has never been shown on television. In the wars of today, it's often daring, independent filmmakers like these who give the victims a voice.
من هاي الباب؟ من هذا الباب ثلاثة، ظليت امشي 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 وراه، وإن جاء واحد أخذ قاعدة من هنا. أنا كل قوتي وخر صفا. كل قوتي فكيت الباب. نعم. فشفته نايم هذا. الدم يسفح من فانيلته. واحد واقف هنا هذا أمريكي. وخره؟ ودوه هنا يا أبا. هنا وقفنا. 11 طاولة. هذيك وحدة. هذيك. دبوه
American journalist Dar Jamal also entered Fallujah independently and revealed that the Americans had used white phosphorus and attacked civilians. His eyewitness dispatches and photographs contradicted the version many people saw and read, but were not published in the mainstream media.
I have photos of trenches being dug, and I watched them burying people there and put little makeshift gravestones, writing anything to try to identify the people. And I walked the rows of these stones after the April siege with one of my interpreters while she read old man in tracksuit with a key in his hand, mother and 2 children. These were the identifying markers, and these are clearly civilians.
What does embedding do to journalists themselves?
An important distinction between embedded journalists and independent journalists is that when you choose to embed, you're giving the military the full power to control where you go, how you get there, what you see, and when you see it, and in a lot of instances, even how you're going to report that.
Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to evacuate the city, refugees in their own land. They were given nowhere to go. Many are still unable to return.
يعني ما يصير هيك يعني الحكومة شلون تقبل يعني يطلعون ذول المجاهدين ويقولون هاي إرهاب وليش مو إخوانك ما يقولون على الحكومة على هذول الكفرة اللي جم قدروا من العراق ما يقولون لهم ليش هالعمل هذا ليش مو الله ما يقبلها.
Evidence that the invaders had terrorized civilians was provided by Al Jazeera and other Arab TV networks, whose fearless, unembedded reporters and camera crews became a threat to military propaganda. They gave voice to people who refused to be betrayed simply as victims.
تفضل يا بوش شوف هذه المآسي ترضى بهيجي انت ترضى بهيجي ظلم انت اكو عندك انسانيه اذا عندك انسانيه تقدر تشوف طفله وهي تصيح ماما بابا 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 وين الإنسانية؟ وين الضمير؟
I happen to be, I think, the only journalist in the world that has seen the bombing of Al Jazeera Arabic's bureaus in both Kabul in 2001 and in Baghdad in 2003. The case of the bombing of the Al Jazeera office in Kabul was, without doubt and categorically, a direct targeting of those journalists to shut them up and possibly kill them.
Al Jazeera had informed Washington.
Every news organization provides Western military commanders with exact coordinates of where their journalists hide. But the point about the bombing of the Al Jazeera Arabic office in Kabul was that they were given a warning to get out. So that was a clear targeting of a journalistic organization and personnel to get them off the air.
Journalists who refuse to go along with the military are often those who report the real news. In August 1945, a public relations spectacle was staged on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, in which General Douglas MacArthur ostentatiously took the surrender of the Japanese. The embedded media were told to attend.
Cameramen and reporters of many countries record this historic moment.
An Australian reporter, Wilfred Burchett of the London Daily Express, refused and set out on a perilous journey for the ruins of Hiroshima. The official truth of the atomic bombing was presented in this New York Times report, which claimed that radiation sickness did not exist. The reporter who wrote the story was later revealed to have been secretly on the payroll of the US War Department. Burchett's historic scoop had exposed the lie. There was, he reported, an atomic plague. I interviewed Wilfred Burchett in 1983, shortly before he died.
Because it was, I think as I described it, it was like a city, not a bomb city, it was like a city over which steamrollers just flattened everything out of existence. What I was seeing there, and this feeling sort of grew into me as I walked around and I looked at people, that here, this is the last minute, what happened in the last minute of World War II, but it would be the fate of cities all over the world in the first hours of a World War III.
What happened to you personally in Japan after that was published?
I went back to Tokyo by train and arrived just as there was a press conference being held to deny my story, because the official line was that there was no such thing as atomic radiation. And that denial of that story has gone on for decades. It's more or less still going on.
The media consensus was that the atomic bombs had brought the war to an end, but official files told another story. A nuclear race had begun, and the Cold War followed. Based on the propaganda of fear, it was a war we never saw but was always threatening. And we never knew how close America came to using nuclear weapons again. What follows is a secret conversation in 1972 between President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, taped in the White House.
I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
Thinking big was what the Bush administration did in February 2003.
The Council who wish to address
This is U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell of the United Nations promoting the invasion of Iraq with an extraordinary theater of the absurd.
Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters if concentrated
Nothing of what he claimed was true. All these pictures were meaningless.
Saddam Hussein's intentions have never changed. He is not developing the missiles for self-defense. These are missiles that Iraq wants in order to project power, to threaten, and to deliver chemical, biological, and, if we let him, nuclear warheads.
This irrefutable, undeniable, incontrovertible evidence today, Colin Powell brilliantly delivered that smoking gun today.
It was devastating. I mean, and overwhelming abundance of the evidence. Point after point after point. He just flooded the terrain with data.
Did Colin Powell close the deal today in your mind for anyone who has yet objectively to make up their mind?
I think for anybody who analyzes the situation, he has closed the deal.
Colin Powell's incredible performance was never seriously challenged in the American broadcast media, of which Rupert Murdoch's Fox Television is the biggest network. Like the rest of the Murdoch empire, it backed the invasion.
We expect every American to support our military, and if they can't do that, to shut up.
How do you steer this thing? I mean, there's no, you have a stick, is that right?
Sure, we have both of us
But the cartoon journalism of Fox can often overshadow the fact that the respectable media has played a critical part in promoting war. Like Fox, the celebrated New York Times published the false claims that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The paper apologized to its readers 1 year later. In Britain, The Observer, another respected liberal newspaper, published the same false claims.
David, you've written about your articles in The Observer in the build-up to the Iraq invasion that you feel, and I quote you, nauseated, angry, and ashamed about what you wrote. What did you mean exactly?
It's now, and has been for a number of years, very painfully apparent that the facts that I believed to be true in those articles were not true. They were a pack of lies fed to me by a fairly sophisticated disinformation campaign.
But didn't it occur to you that these people were professional liars?
I overcame what should have been stronger doubts. I can make no excuses. I should have been more sceptical.
I mean, you finished off one of your articles by expressing almost a little editorial at the end, which you wrote that for the West, Iraq was, and I quote, an ideal place to establish a bridgehead. There are occasions in history, you wrote, when the use of force is both right and sensible. This is one of them. I mean, in essence, you were advocating an attack on a defenseless country. That's quite something, isn't it?
What has happened, the enormity of what has happened in Iraq is far bigger than, my own embarrassment, my own feelings. And what happened was a crime. It was a crime on a very large scale.
Does that make a journalist accomplices?
Yeah, broadly. Unwitting, perhaps, but yes.
CBS News special report is part of our continuing coverage of America at War. Here is Dan Rather.
For 24 years, the most famous news anchor on American television was Dan Rather.
Your own career is remarkable for many things, but one of them in that you have stood up to power. Your questioning of Nixon, which I remember, back in '74, and also your interview over Irangate with Bush Sr. But then later on, you appeared famously on the David Letterman show, which I happened to see. And you said George Bush is the president, he makes the decisions, and you know, as just one American, wherever he wants me to line up, just tell me where and he'll make the call. Why did you say that?
This was in the almost immediate wake of 9/11. And that's the way I genuinely felt. I was responding as an American citizen in a personal way. And I have said that whether those of us in journalism want to admit it or not, then at least in some small way, fear is present in every newsroom in the country. A fear of losing your job, a fear of the institution, the company you work for going out of business, the fear of being stuck with some label, unpatriotic or otherwise, that you will have with you to your grave and beyond. The fear that there's so much at stake for the country that by doing what you deeply feel is your job will somehow be embarrassed. All of these things go into the mix. But it's very important for me to say, because I firmly believe it, I'm not the vice president in charge of excuses, that we shouldn't have excuses. What we should do is take a really good look at that period and learn from it and, suck up our courage.
Charles Hanley, who won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting, was in Iraq in January of 2003, and he went to all the sites that had been named by Bush officials as suspicious sites, El Tuwaitha and Fallujah. He went to every site that had been named by George Bush, Cheney, Rice, Colin Powell, and he found that in every case they were still sealed since 1991 when they had been sealed by UN inspectors. He filed a report on January 18th. It went to every major newsroom in the United States because it's the AP, which goes to every major newsroom in the United States. Got no pickup. No one published it. It didn't fit the script. It got virtually no pickup. It didn't fit the script. We were going to war no matter what. I think that if good media coverage, good journalism that tells truth to power can make a huge, huge difference. So do I think that we would have gone to war if the media had done their job and had challenged not just the lies about weapons of mass destruction, but the lies about how Saddam kicked the inspectors out in 1998 and the whole litany of propaganda that led up to March 20th, 2003, the launch of the war. I think if the media had been challenging that, I think we would not have gone to war.
Jeremy Paxman said last year he and the rest of the media had been hoodwinked in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, what I think I would say about that is that clearly we did not realize until much later in the day that the weapons of mass destruction were not there. And of course there was the so-called dodgy dossier as well. So there is quite a body of evidence to build up to suggest that the media certainly were taken in by the claims that were coming from government at that point, yes.
Why didn't the media get it? Why didn't the BBC get it?
I think that we didn't get it partly because of lack of access. If you want to find out what's happening, then you really need to go there and do some first-hand reporting, which wasn't possible in the run-up to the war in Iraq.
But the crucial facts were available. The chief United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq, Scott Ritter, gave me this interview 4 years before the invasion.
In 1991, Iraq had significant capability in the area of chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons production capability, and long-range ballistic missile manufacturing capability. By 1998, the chemical weapons infrastructure had been completely dismantled or destroyed by UNSCOM or by Iraq in compliance with UNSCOM's mandate. The biological weapons program had been declared in its totality late in the game, but it was gone. All the major facilities eliminated. The nuclear weapons program, again, completely eliminated. The long-range ballistic missile program, completely eliminated. All that was left was the research and development and manufacturing capability for missiles with a range less than 150 kilometers, a permitted activity. Everything that we set out to destroy in 1991, the physical infrastructure had been eliminated. So if I had to quantify Iraq's threat in terms of weapons of mass destruction, the real threat is zero, none.
The former chief weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, was saying as early as 1998 that Saddam Hussein was completely disarmed. Scott Ritter, I think, appeared in 2003 twice, and once at 3 in the morning on BBC 24 News. He was a vital expert witness, and there were others.
Well, I don't know why Scott Ritter didn't appear more, but he clearly did appear at times.
That's the question for the BBC. Why weren't those who were
Why weren't those
witnesses
voices heard?
Yes.
Well, because there were also other voices that we were putting on the air, Unscombe, Mohammed Al-Baradei, Hans Blix. So we were actually listening to those voices. But yeah, I think you've got a good point. You know, why didn't we? It's a question that we asked ourselves afterwards. Why was it that we didn't discover this first? Didn't discover the state of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction?
I think what critics of that would say is that the broadcasters, notably the BBC, echoed or amplified the lies told in the run-up to the invasion, rather than investigating itself.
What the BBC, though, have a duty to do is to report what governments and their representatives are saying, which we, of course, did. We were just reporting, quite legitimately, the claims that people at the time were making.
They weren't legitimate claims, though.
They were in the mouths of legitimate leaders, though, and therefore we had a duty to report that.
But those leaders, both of them you mentioned, Blair and Bush, have long been discredited. I mean, isn't it the BBC's role, as well as reporting what politicians say, to hold power to account?
Of course it is. It's the BBC's duty to scrutinise what it is that people say. We're not there to accuse them of lying, though, because that's a judgment.
No, that's not being suggested, that you make a judgment. The point is that it appears now that those important journalistic challenges were never made.
It's not up to me to make a judgment. We're there to report what their claims are and hold them up to scrutiny and investigate.
In August 2002, ITV reported a warning by Vice President Cheney that Iraq would soon have a nuclear weapon. And that was nonsense. But it was presented uncritically as news. Wouldn't you say that that contributed to the invasion that happened the following March?
Well, it might have done, but with respect, not our fault. I mean, I don't believe that you're suggesting, are you, that we should completely dismiss the words of arguably the second most powerful man in the Western world? We reported it. We didn't necessarily agree with it. We reported it and allowed our viewers to make up their minds as to whether this was a man telling the truth or not.
No, but that's not fair on viewers, is it? Because they may not know what we as journalists know or ought to know, that this was an extremely dodgy politician who was making extraordinary claims.
If we knew it, we should have said so. If we didn't know it, we can't. And that applies across everything. But you're absolutely right in one regard. We shouldn't take things at face value. We should do our best to investigate. And when we do know, we should tell our viewers. Of course we should. That's part of the process of being a journalistically based organisation.
I mean, I was thinking of Blair's many statements. One, on the 29th of January 2003, ITV News reported Blair as saying, "We do know of links between Al-Qaeda and Iraq." These links, as you know, didn't exist.
I mean, we're getting into the realms of sort of semantics now, but
they're very important semantics,
he used the word links. between the two. Your quotation, not mine.
Well,
I think
that was the quotation from ITV News.
Yeah, from Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Links. Now, links can mean 1,000 things. It doesn't necessarily mean a bond of support, of mutual support.
There were no links.
Well, look, I'm sitting here across you. You're telling me that. I would say to you, well, show me that there were no links. Show me that they'd never... Show me that they'd never...
Even those claiming links said there were no links.
Any communications of any kind between those two organisations.
Come on.
It's impossible to do that. And he chose his words carefully. And of course...
Well, they're not careful. We do know of links between Al-Qaeda and Iraq.
Yeah, but the word links... could mean 1,000 things, is the point I'm saying here. And you're not suggesting, I'm sure, that we shouldn't have reported what the Prime Minister was saying.
You were talking about semantics a little while ago.
Well, I find it virtually impossible to believe that Britain could have got away with the invasion of Iraq if the media had been doing its job. When Blair was standing up and saying our policy in the region was to bolster the forces of democracy, I mean, really, the proper reaction to that would have been to burst out laughing. There's simply no history of that at all. Britain has been on the side of authoritarian, repressive regimes. They are our allies. The Omanis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, they are our allies, not the more democratic, more liberal forces in the region. And I think that if journalists had even had a slight interest in looking at the history and in looking at what the government was actually saying at the time, or what the evidence was at the time, they would have reported things in such a manner that the government just would not have been able to have got away with what they did.
Vietnam. Welcome to the Dawn Buster.
This was the Vietnam War, which I reported. A new military jargon, collateral damage, was designed for the media and to cover up the scale of the industrial killing of up to 3 million people and the terror of indiscriminate bombing, often known as turkey shoots. The longest bombing campaign in history happened here in North Vietnam, mostly unseen from outside. This is a photograph of the town of Ham Long in the north. Not a building remained, only bomb craters. Pictures like this were seldom published. Vietnam was the blueprint for the wars of today. Murder and destruction replaced military tactics. Almost every man, woman and child became the enemy.
Now some people running along the dike. Roger. Good job. I saw you splatter one right in the back with a rocket. Roger, got lucky again.
It's time that we recognized ours was in truth a noble cause.
As in previous wars, public memory of the Vietnam War was greatly influenced by Hollywood. The Deer Hunter, Platoon, Good Morning Vietnam, The Green Berets. All these films perpetuated an illusion, turning fiction into truth. The theme was fake heroism and self-pity. The invader as victim, purged of all crime. Today, a series of Iraq war movies follows the tradition. The current Oscar winner, The Hurt Locker, is the familiar story of a psychopath high on violence in somebody else's country, where the suffering of its people.
And my job is to keep you safe so we can keep going on missions. Calm down, buddy.
What I saw was a film that was a complete celebration of the lone lunatic, but who ultimately, you know, is the quintessential American hero. Because lone lunatics are very big in this country. We even elect them president sometimes. This film is a film about killing, in which killing is completely incidental. And this is a war that was orchestrated purely for profit and for oil and for ownership of other people's resources and for control of global resources.
This is another war we don't see in Britain. In this video, British soldiers are abusing Iraqi civilians. A public inquiry into the killing of Baha Musa, an Iraqi hotel worker, has been told that British soldiers have tortured and killed prisoners. Phil Shiner is the lawyer acting for more than 100 Iraqi families.
Modern democracies don't leave marks, so stealth torture. So the things that we developed, and we weren't alone, the Americans did the same, obviously, are much more subtle. Leaving someone hooded, putting someone into a wall-standing position, depriving them of food and water, etc. My clients complain of every type of threat, that your women will be brought here and raped in front of you, that, death threats, you will be transferred to Guantanamo Bay. And frankly, people should be prosecuted for a lot of the things that I'm talking about in criminal courts, not military courts. You can't have soldiers prosecuting other soldiers being tried by a panel of soldiers. The court-martial system, in my view, has utterly failed. That's got to go. You need the people who are complicit in it all. You need them prosecuted.
What role do you think embedding plays in this?
Well, the problem with embedded journalism is all we're seeing is the point of view of the troops. We're not seeing or hearing from the civilians who are on the wrong end of their tactics. So let's take detention. It seems clear that British forces in Iraq killed many people, maybe hundreds of civilians, when they had custody of them, and did the most extraordinary, brutal things involving sexual acts, etc. Embedded journalism is never, ever going to get close to hearing the story of those Iraqis.
This is the B-1 Lancer bomber, which cost the American taxpayer $283 million each. And this is what it did on May the 4th, 2009, in Farah province, Afghanistan, following false intelligence of Taliban in a village. Its victims were some of the poorest people on earth. Guy Smallman is an independent photojournalist and the first Westerner to arrive in the village following the bombing.
The first strike happened outside the village mosque, which was the first place that I was taken to. Was just a mass of craters, and several bombs had fallen in that area. Then after that, the women and children were evacuated to a compound in the far north of the village. And again, their heat signatures were picked up by the bomber crew. And a 2,000-pound bomb was dropped into the middle of them, and that was where the majority of the people died. The first thing that struck me when I was going in there was the silence. I mean, the Afghan countryside is usually a symphony of birdsong, and it was absolutely dead quiet, and the locals had done their best to collect all the bodies and the body parts, but there were still flies swarming all around the area. There was still a very pungent smell of death, very heavy in the air. I think the thing that struck me more than anything else was the children. It was almost as if all their energy and emotions had been drained out of them, and they would stare right through me and my translator into the middle distance. They didn't laugh, they barely spoke at all. And that, I think, left the most lasting impression. And I was given quite a grim tour of where people were buried. In a lot of cases, entire families were buried in the same grave. I think I counted just over 70 new graves, fresh graves. And then at one far end of the cemetery, there's an enormous mass grave which is around 30 metres across. And in that grave are the remains of 55 people, and they had to be buried there together because they were quite literally blown into pieces, and it was impossible to tell who was who, so they had to bury them together in one long trench. And then there was the difference about the casualties. The local people insisted that over 140 civilians had died, and NATO said there was 25.
So the deaths of 147 people, including 93 children, became a dispute over...
Became a dispute over a body count, and nothing more. Now, I know for a fact that the pictures taken by the Afghan radio journalist were out there. I know that stringers on the ground were filing those pictures. And I mean, a lot of those pictures were very graphic, but a lot of them, you know, did show people digging bodies out of the rubble. It did show those bodies lined up for burial.
Why do you think British audiences and other Western audiences have no real sense of an atrocity of this scale?
I think people become desensitized to it. When they're told on the news a wedding party has been attacked by accident, a compound has been bombed by accident, a farmer and his family have been killed by accident, they don't really connect with it, because they don't actually get to see those bodies.
The faces, the names are not known to them.
The names, it's just a number. Whether they're Afghans or Iraqis or Lebanese civilians, they're just numbers. And it's perhaps easy to understand why British Muslims feel completely disenfranchised from our domestic news services.
I think the press really conspires to play down the carnage in Iraq and Afghanistan. This gets to what the great American writer and academic Ed Herman called worthy and unworthy victims. The Iraqis are not worthy victims, so we can play down their deaths, because if we accept the reality that there are more than 1 million dead, it's largely our fault. And so, for instance, the U.S. press will talk about 200,000 to 400,000 dead in Somalia. Those victims are worthy victims because they were killed by people that we don't like. And in one bizarre case, which talked about the cultural peculiarities of Afghan society, because they actually got rankled when you killed their family members, their civilian family members. And in another case, they said that they argued that Afghan society was peculiar because they didn't like people breaking into their houses in the middle of the night. You know, and this caused them to get angry and sometimes carry out vendettas.
This is the British Armed Forces Memorial in Staffordshire. It's not as well known as the great cenotaphs, and it holds many secrets. There are 16,000 names here. Every year since 1948, British forces have been in action somewhere in the world, and there's space for another 15,000 names of young servicemen and women waiting to die. What's extraordinary about this memorial is its record of constant war during so-called peacetime, as if revealing the secret of Britain's enduring imperial role. What's missing is any record of the victims of these wars, the countless men, women and children killed mostly in their own countries, in our name, and glimpsed only now and then on the TV news. At least 1 million people have died as a result of the invasion of Iraq. They are not part of our remembrance because they're not allowed in our memory. Mark Curtis is an historian who writes on British foreign policy. His specialty is revealing long-forgotten official files.
I've certainly uncovered a lot of episodes where Britain has been either involved in coups or has been involved in military interventions that have appalling impacts on people's lives that simply never get mentioned. They're never referred to in the newspapers. They never get on TV histories of Britain. They're just taken out, basically. They're deleted from our historical memory.
Why does the public in Britain have such little idea of the sheer scale of this?
Well, a very large reason for that is that, I mean, if you look at every war or every coup or every regime that Britain is supporting or been involved in, it's usually accompanied by an increasingly sophisticated public relations operation by the government. We're told that British foreign policy is based on promoting democracy, on spreading development and promoting human rights. Well, if you read the actual government planning files, planners are saying to themselves that their policy is not based on that. It's based on the control of oil. It's based on creating an international economy that works in the interest of British corporations, and it's based on maintaining their great power status. This culture of impunity is deeply embedded within British society. I mean, if you go back, say in the 1960s, a time when Britain was covertly supporting an Indonesian military that was killing up to 1 million people, where Britain was responsible for depopulating the Chagos Islands, and where Britain was arming the Nigerian government that was killing hundreds of thousands of Biafrans in the civil war in Nigeria. All of that was taking place under the Labour government in the 1960s, and none of those ministers have ever been questioned, and yet those decisions cost literally millions of lives.
The attack on Iraq did not begin with shock and awe. During the first Gulf War in 1991, Britain and America deliberately bombed Iraq's modern infrastructure. And when the war was over, the bombing continued. This was seldom reported. During this period of the 1990s, the UN imposed an economic blockade led by Britain and America. Essentials like clean water and vital drugs were denied. In 1998, the United Nations Children's Fund reported the deaths of 500,000 children under the age of 5, a direct result of the sanctions imposed by the blockade. This is Dennis Halliday, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, who resigned after refusing to administer the sanctions. In 1999, I travelled with him to Iraq.
The very provisions of the Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights have been set aside. And we are waging a warfare through the United Nations on the children and people of Iraq with incredible results. Results that you do not expect to see in a war under the Geneva Conventions. We're targeting civilians. Worse, we're targeting children like Safa, who of course were not born when Iraq went into Kuwait. I mean, what is this about? It's a monstrous situation for the United Nations, for the Western world, for all of us who are part of some democratic system, who are, in fact, responsible for the policies of our governments and the implementation of economic sanctions.